The morning sunlight fell over Lakeview like a slow golden tide, spilling through the branches of old maples and painting the streets with a warm shimmer. The small Oregon town was waking to the sounds of laughter, bicycles on pavement, and the faint hum of carnival music drifting from the direction of the amusement park. It was the kind of summer day that seemed to carry a promise of simple happiness, of memories waiting to be made. For Amelia Carter, it was supposed to be exactly that. She had planned this day for weeks, wanting to give her little boy a break from hospital visits and the quiet days spent at home. The pregnancy had been complicated, and the doctor's orders were strict. She was to remain seated as much as possible, avoiding exertion at all costs. The wheelchair had become both her freedom and her prison, a reminder of her limits and of the life she carried within her. Emilia sat in the passenger side of the family car, her hands resting protectively over her rounded belly. Her son Noah sat in the back seat, his face pressed against the window as he watched the distant Ferris wheel turn slowly against the sky. His excitement was contagious. She smiled, feeling a warmth that almost erased the fatigue that had become her constant companion. Today was supposed to be special. Her husband, Mark, had promised to join them after finishing an early meeting at the FBI field office in Portland. He had insisted she wait for him, but Amelia had wanted to surprise Noah with a head start. She knew how much her son loved the park, the cotton candy, the dizzy rides, the smell of popcorn that clung to the air like sweet dust. When she parked near the entrance, the morning rush had already begun. Families streamed toward the gates with strollers and balloons, laughter echoing beneath the fluttering flags. Amelia took a slow breath, steadying herself before opening the car door. She had done this many times before, transferring carefully into the wheelchair, making sure her movements were controlled, not straining the muscles that ached easily now. Noah rushed to her side, eager to help. His small hands fumbled with the wheelchair's handles, his face serious in that way children mimic responsibility. She thanked him softly and smoothed his hair, her heart swelling with pride. "Mom, can we go to the roller coaster first?" he asked as they rolled toward the main path. "Let's see how long the lines are," she said with a laugh. "Maybe we'll start with something a little calmer." The path to the special entrance for visitors with disabilities was shaded by tall trees, their leaves whispering above. Amelia loved this part of the park, the quiet before the noise, the hum of distant rides blending with birdsong. She felt almost normal here, just another mother on a summer outing. Yet she was always aware of the stares. They came subtly, sometimes kindly, sometimes with that hint of pity she had learned to ignore. She pushed forward, the steady rhythm of the wheels grounding her. As they neared the gate marked for accessible access, a man in a dark uniform stepped into view. He was tall and broad, his posture rigid, his eyes following her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Security guards were common here, usually friendly, sometimes overly cautious. But this one's gaze made her uneasy. His name tag read, Harris. He stood with arms folded, blocking the narrow gate. "Good morning," Amelia said, keeping her tone polite. "We're here for the accessible entrance. I have my documents if you need them." The man didn't return the greeting. His eyes flicked down to her, then to the boy at her side. There was a brief pause before he spoke. "You sure you're in the right place?" His tone wasn't curious, it was doubtful, edged with something harder. Amelia blinked, unsure how to respond at first. "Yes," she said carefully. "I believe so." "This entrance is for visitors with mobility limitations." Harris exhaled through his nose, shifting his weight. "We've had people try to use this lane when they didn't need to," he said. "You'd be surprised what some folks will do to skip the line." Her hands tightened on the wheels. She had heard variations of that before. The insinuation that she was taking advantage of something meant for others. "I'm not trying to skip anything," she said softly. "I'm in my 3rd trimester, and walking long distances isn't possible for me right now." He gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You don't look like you need it that bad." The words hit her with unexpected force. For a moment she couldn't speak. Noah, sensing her discomfort, moved closer, his small fingers curling around the armrest of her chair. Amelia forced herself to breathe. "I have medical documentation," she said, "if you'd like to verify it." He didn't even glance at the folder she opened. His eyes were cold, his mouth a thin line. "Anyone can get a doctor to sign off on something," he muttered. You'll need more than that. A flush of heat rose to her face, part anger, part humiliation. She could feel the first stirrings of eyes on them. People were starting to notice. A young couple whispered nearby. A man holding a toddler slowed his steps. The moment stretched painfully. She wanted to disappear, to shield Noah from it, to keep the day from unraveling. "Please," she said quietly. "We're just here to enjoy the park. My husband will be here soon if you want to verify anything with him." But Harris was unmoved. He pulled a small radio from his belt. "We'll let an officer take a look," he said flatly. "Better to be safe than sorry." The click of the radio filled the silence that followed. Amelia's stomach twisted as she realized how quickly things were spiraling beyond her control. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet she suddenly felt like a suspect. Noah's voice trembled beside her. "Mom, did we do something bad?" She turned to him, managing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, sweetheart. Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. Her heart pounded, her palms damp against the metal rims. She had seen stories, too many of them, about encounters like this that turned ugly for no reason. She thought of Mark and wished he were there, his calm presence, his way of diffusing tension before it caught fire. Minutes passed. The sound of laughter from the rides seemed far away now, muffled by the pulse in her ears. A few more bystanders had gathered, curious about the scene at the gate. Some looked sympathetic. Others simply watched with detached interest, as if this were part of the park's entertainment. Amelia straightened in her chair, trying to project calm even as fear crept into her chest. When the distant wail of a siren reached her ears, she felt her heart drop. She hadn't expected it to happen this fast. The guard stepped aside slightly, his expression grimly satisfied. "They'll sort this out," he said, as though this were a routine inconvenience. The police cruiser rolled up to the curb, blue lights flashing against the bright day. Children stopped eating cotton candy to watch. Parents hushed them, but they watched too. The door opened and an officer stepped out, a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered, his movements brisk, practiced. His name tag read, Officer Collins. His expression was already hardened by assumption. Harris met him halfway, speaking in low tones. Amelia couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She could read the set of their shoulders, the way Collins' eyes flicked toward her, measuring, judging. When he approached, his shadow fell over her. "I've been told there's a problem," he said. "You're using a wheelchair to access this entrance, but there's some concern about the legitimacy of your need." Amelia's throat tightened. "I have medical documents," she said, lifting the folder again. "I'm pregnant and walking causes contractions. That's why—" Collins cut her off with a small shake of his head. "Ma'am, anyone can get a doctor to write a note. Happens all the time." Something inside her cracked at those words. The exhaustion of months of caution, the endless need to justify her condition to strangers, the constant fear of being doubted, it all converged into a quiet, burning anger. She forced her voice to stay steady. "I shouldn't have to prove my pain to you," she said. "I'm simply trying to use the facilities provided for people like me." But the officer wasn't listening. His gaze was cold, indifferent. Around them, murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Noah clutched the handle of the wheelchair, his knuckles white. Amelia's breath came shorter now, her chest tight with dread. The officer's next words made her blood run cold. "If you're really unable to walk," he said, "you can show me. Stand up for a second." For a heartbeat, she thought she'd misheard. Then the meaning sank in. He was demanding that she rise to prove she was telling the truth. The humiliation was complete. She shook her head slowly, disbelief in her voice. "I can't," she whispered. "It's dangerous for me to stand." He frowned as if her refusal were defiance. "Then I'll have to assume you're obstructing an investigation," he said, one hand resting on the cuffs at his belt. The crowd murmured louder now, some voices sharp with disbelief. Amelia's pulse hammered in her ears. She looked at Noah's wide, frightened eyes and felt something inside her harden. This couldn't be happening, not here, not in front of her son. She had come to give him joy, not this nightmare. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled with tears. And then, through the blur of noise and faces, she heard a familiar voice call her name. It cut through everything, the fear, the shame, the chaos. She turned her head and saw Mark running toward them from across the plaza, his jacket still on, his badge glinting faintly in the sunlight. Relief and apprehension collided in her chest. He was moving fast, his face set in controlled fury, the kind she had only seen when he faced something truly unjust. People turned to watch him, whispering as he approached. The officer straightened, stepping back slightly, but not enough. The moment was balanced on a knife's edge, the tension so thick it felt like the world was holding its breath. Emilia's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her pulse wild. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Their day at Lakeview Park, the day that had begun with sunshine and laughter, was never going to be the same again. Mark's voice seemed to tear through the air, like a crack of thunder, and for a moment, everything froze. The officer turned, his hand still hovering over his belt, his expression flickering between irritation and surprise. Emilia's heart raced as she watched her husband approach, his strides purposeful and charged with the unmistakable energy of someone who had seen too much and was done watching in silence. The crowd parted instinctively, murmuring among themselves. Mark's jacket was unbuttoned, his badge barely visible against the navy fabric. But there was something in his bearing, something firm and trained that carried its own authority. Emilia's relief was palpable, but it was mixed with dread. She knew Mark well enough to recognize the tension in his jaw, the steel in his eyes. He had always been calm under pressure, but nothing in his FBI training had prepared him for walking into a scene like this, with his pregnant wife in a wheelchair being treated like a criminal and his child trembling beside her. He stopped beside them, his presence instantly filling the space. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice controlled but edged with anger. Officer Collins straightened, meeting Mark's gaze with a defensive stiffness. "Sir, please step back. This is an ongoing situation. We received a report of possible misuse of park facilities for the disabled, and we're just trying to verify this lady's condition." Mark's expression hardened. "This lady," he said slowly, "is my wife." The words carried weight, cutting through the crowd's whispers. "And you're making a serious mistake." Emilia looked up at him, her hands trembling on the wheelchair's arms. The moment their eyes met, she felt both relief and guilt. Relief that he was there now, and guilt that he had to see her humiliated like this. She wanted to tell him not to make it worse, not to lose his temper, but the words caught in her throat. The officer's tone was clipped, defensive. "Sir, we just need to confirm her eligibility for this entrance. We can't take everyone's word for it." Mark took a breath, fighting to steady his voice. "She provided documentation," he said, gesturing toward the folder in her lap. "Medical records signed by her doctor. You ignored them. Now you're escalating a situation that never should have gone this far." Collins's eyes narrowed, a hint of defiance flaring in them. "We've had people forge notes before. I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Mark said quietly, "is to protect citizens, not harass them." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Harris, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The onlookers, emboldened by Mark's words, began to whisper louder, their phones raised, recording every second. Emilia could feel the heat rising to her face again, not from embarrassment this time, but from fear of what might come next. She knew how quickly things could turn violent when pride collided with authority. Officer Collins took a step forward, his posture growing more rigid. "Sir, I need you to calm down and step aside. Interfering with a police investigation is a serious offense." Mark's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "An investigation?" he said. "You call this an investigation? You're bullying a pregnant woman because you think you can." The crowd's murmuring swelled. A woman near the front shook her head in disbelief, whispering, "This is insane." A man nearby called out, "She's got papers. Let them go." The tension thickened, the energy of the crowd shifting from passive curiosity to outrage. The officer's face flushed, his grip tightening near his cuffs. His pride had been challenged, and he was not the type to back down easily. Emilia watched the scene unfold, helpless, torn between terror and disbelief. The whole situation had spiraled beyond reason. She could see Noah's wide eyes darting between his parents, confusion and fear etched into his small face. He clutched the handle of the wheelchair tighter, his knuckles pale. "Mommy, why are they mad?" he whispered, but his voice was swallowed by the noise around them. Emilia wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be all right, but she didn't know if she could believe it herself. Her stomach was tight, and a dull ache pulsed beneath her ribs. She tried to breathe slowly, the way her doctor had taught her, but each breath caught in her throat as the argument escalated. Officer Collins's voice grew sharper. "Sir, I'm giving you one last warning. Step back and let me do my job." Mark didn't move. "And I'm telling you," he said, his words steady but filled with heat, "that your job doesn't include violating people's rights, especially not hers." That was when Collins snapped. His eyes blazed with a mix of indignation and fury. "Enough!" he barked, reaching out and shoving the wheelchair backward with one hand. The sudden motion jolted Emilia violently. Pain shot through her abdomen, and she gasped, clutching at her belly. Noah screamed. The crowd erupted, voices shouting, people rushing forward. Someone yelled, "Hey, you can't do that!" Another shouted, "She's pregnant!" Mark's world tunneled into a single moment. Everything, the noise, the faces, the flashing lights blurred. All he could see was his wife's face twisted in pain, and the officer standing over her. He lunged forward, grabbing the wheelchair handles before the officer could touch them again. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice low, trembling with restrained rage. Collins stepped back, one hand already reaching for his cuffs. "You're under arrest for obstruction," he said. "Turn around." "Arrest me?" Mark's laugh was short and sharp, devoid of humor. "For what, defending my wife from you?" "Sir, turn around now," Collins barked. The younger officer who had arrived with him moved closer, uncertain but following his lead. Emilia's breathing grew shallow. She felt trapped, cornered by the chaos that had swallowed what was supposed to be a simple day. She wanted to scream that it was enough, that she couldn't take any more, but her voice refused to come. She could only watch as her husband stood there, facing two armed officers, the crowd chanting around them. Mark's hand went slowly to his jacket. "You really want to do this?" he asked quietly. "Fine." He pulled out his badge and held it up for all to see. The gold glinted in the sun. "Special Agent Mark Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you, Officer Collins, are about 3 seconds away from ending your career." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Collins froze mid-step. The younger officer's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly as the realization hit. Cameras were recording, witnesses everywhere. The crowd's energy shifted again, from outrage to anticipation. Emilia could feel the tide turning, but didn't dare move. She was too afraid of what one wrong motion could set off. Collins' face reddened, his pride stinging like an open wound. "I don't care who you are," he said, though his voice was no longer steady. "You can't interfere with police business." "This stopped being police business the moment you assaulted my wife," Mark said. His words carried the quiet weight of truth. Around them, several people clapped or shouted in agreement. Phones were raised higher now, lenses catching every flicker of emotion on the officer's face. Collins glanced around and saw his control slipping away. His authority was cracking under the gaze of 100 witnesses. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension was suffocating. Then Emilia's body betrayed her. A sharp pain sliced through her abdomen, stronger than before, and she doubled over with a soft cry. Mark dropped to his knees beside her instantly, all his anger replaced with panic. "Hey, hey," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Breathe, Em. It's all right. I'm here." The crowd fell silent. Even Collins hesitated, his hand frozen near his belt. The younger officer took a half-step forward, uncertainty etched into his face. "She needs medical attention," he muttered. "We should call an ambulance." Collins glared at him but said nothing. The truth of it hung heavy in the air. The woman before them was clearly in distress, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling. There was no denying it now. The lie he had convinced himself of, that she was just another fraud, was crumbling in front of everyone's eyes. Mark's anger was gone now, replaced by cold, focused fear. He helped steady Emilia's breathing, whispering words she barely heard. She clung to the sound of his voice, to the warmth of his hand on hers, the world spinning wildly around her. Somewhere behind them, someone in the crowd was already on the phone with emergency services. The distant wail of another siren grew louder. Collins stepped back, realizing how far things had gone. But the damage was done. Dozens of videos were already being uploaded, shared, spreading across social media faster than any official report could hope to contain. When the paramedics arrived, Emilia barely registered the flurry of movement. The stretcher, the cool hands lifting her, the murmured reassurance that she and the baby would be checked at the hospital. Through it all, she kept her eyes on Mark. He was talking to one of the paramedics, his voice low and calm again, but the tightness in his shoulders betrayed him. He looked over at Collins one last time, his expression unreadable. "You'll answer for this," he said quietly. As the ambulance doors closed, the crowd erupted again, not with anger this time, but with a kind of fierce approval. Someone shouted, "We've got your back." Another called, "Make them pay." It was a small comfort, but in that moment, it mattered. For the first time since the morning had begun, Emilia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice would come. Mark stood by the gate long after the ambulance had left, the hum of its siren fading into the distance. The park had returned to its strange normalcy, the laughter of children once again mixing with the smell of popcorn. But for him, nothing was normal anymore. The image of his wife's face, twisted in pain, replayed in his mind like a wound that wouldn't close. He knew this was only the beginning. The confrontation at Lakeview Park wasn't just an incident, it was a spark, and he intended to make sure that it ignited something far larger than the anger of one afternoon. The drive to the hospital blurred into a series of fragmented images that Emilia would later struggle to piece together. The flashing red lights reflecting against the windshield, the low murmur of the paramedics, the rhythmic beeping of machines that seemed both far away and inside her own chest. The pain had dulled into something heavy and pulsing, a reminder of the fear that had gripped her so completely back at the park. But beneath the fear, something else was beginning to take root, a slow, simmering anger. It wasn't the kind that shouted or cursed. It was quieter, steadier, the kind that grew stronger with every breath. She lay on the hospital bed, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, as if guarding the child inside her from the ugliness of the world outside. Mark stood at the foot of the bed, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. His tie was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper than before. The doctor had assured them that both Emilia and the baby were stable. The stress had caused the contractions, nothing more. But the emotional toll lingered. She watched him pacing the small room, his movements controlled, every gesture deliberate. He was trying to keep his composure, but she could see the storm beneath the surface. When he finally stopped and looked at her, there was both relief and fury in his eyes. "They crossed a line," he said quietly, his voice low, the words almost trembling with restraint. "They laid hands on you, Em. They pushed you, accused you, humiliated you in front of our son." He paused, exhaling sharply. "I'm not letting that go." Emilia closed her eyes for a moment. She wanted to tell him she didn't want revenge, that she just wanted peace, but she knew that wasn't entirely true. The memory of Officer Collins' sneer, the disbelief in his voice, the way he had treated her like a liar, it all burned in her chest. "I know," she said softly, "but we have to be careful, Mark. This isn't just about us anymore." "It's exactly about us," he countered. "And people like us. People who get pushed around because someone in uniform thinks they can get away with it." He rubbed a hand over his face, his frustration spilling out in restless movement. "I've seen men like him before, full of pride, convinced their badge gives them the right to decide who deserves respect. He didn't see a woman. He saw a problem he needed to control." Oh, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Emilia looked at him, her heart tightening. She had known Mark's sense of justice was strong. That was what had drawn her to him in the first place. But now that same conviction looked dangerous. "Promise me you won't do anything reckless," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For Noah. For the baby." Mark met her gaze, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he nodded, though she could tell the promise was more for her peace of mind than a reflection of his intentions. "I won't," he said finally, "but I'm not staying silent either." Later that evening, after Emilia had fallen asleep, Mark stepped out into the hospital corridor. His phone had been buzzing nonstop messages from his supervisor, from reporters, from colleagues who had seen the footage already circulating online. The videos were everywhere now, shared thousands of times, accompanied by headlines that varied from sympathetic to sensational. He ignored most of them, scrolling until he reached the one that mattered, a message from his partner at the bureau, confirming that the department was aware of what had happened and that internal affairs had already contacted the Lakeview police. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. The next morning, when Amelia was discharged, she insisted on going home rather than to a hotel. She said she needed to be in her own bed, surrounded by the familiar rhythm of their life. Noah clung to her side, quiet and watchful, his usual chatter replaced by cautious glances and whispered questions. Mark carried her bag, his expression unreadable, the silence between them heavy but necessary. They both knew words would come later, when the numbness wore off, when the anger fully settled in. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the golden light filtered through their living room windows, Mark sat at the table with his laptop open and a stack of papers beside him. Amelia watched from the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her hand absently stroking Noah's hair as he slept against her. She wanted to tell Mark to rest, to let it go for one night, but she knew better. He was in his element, now focused, methodical, determined. "I filed a formal complaint," he said without looking up. "The department will have to respond, and I've contacted a lawyer who specializes in civil rights cases. They want to meet tomorrow." Amelia nodded slowly. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Mark looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "It has to," he said. "If we don't push back, they'll bury it under reports and excuses. They'll say it was a misunderstanding, that the officer was just doing his job. But there were cameras, Em. Witnesses. They can't twist this one." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that truth still mattered, that justice was possible if you fought hard enough. But she had lived long enough to know that systems protected their own, that apologies rarely came without pressure. Still, there was something in Mark's conviction that gave her hope, even if it was fragile. Days turned into a blur of phone calls and meetings. Reporters camped outside their house, eager for interviews. Civil rights groups reached out, offering support. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of everything wrong with the way authority treated ordinary people. Amelia found herself caught between exhaustion and disbelief. One moment, she was just a woman trying to keep her family safe. The next, she was at the center of a national conversation she hadn't asked for. Meanwhile, the tension in Lakeview simmered. The police department issued a brief statement acknowledging the incident and promising a review, but no apology came. Officer Collins was placed on administrative leave, though rumors circulated that he was furious about being set up. Averime. The local community was divided. Some called for his dismissal, while others defended him, saying he had just been following protocol. It was a familiar pattern, one that played out in headlines across the country, but now it had a face, Amelia's. As the days passed, Mark grew restless. Each evening, he sat with his phone in hand, scrolling through comments, messages, updates from their lawyer. Amelia could see how much it was eating at him, the frustration of watching bureaucracy move too slowly, the helplessness of knowing that justice was never swift. One night, after Noah had gone to bed, she found him standing by the window, staring out into the quiet street. "They're not going to let this go easily," he said without turning around. "Collins still has friends in that department. He's going to fight back." "We'll fight harder," Amelia said softly. He turned to her then, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. "You shouldn't have to fight," he said. "You should have been safe." She walked up to him, resting her hand on his arm. "Maybe, but we don't get to choose the battles that find us. We just decide how to face them." The words lingered between them, simple but true. For the first time since that day at the park, Mark smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. He kissed her forehead, and for a brief, fleeting moment, they both allowed themselves to believe that maybe things would be all right. But peace was short-lived. The following week, a new video surfaced, footage from another angle, showing the exact moment Officer Collins shoved Amelia's wheelchair. The outcry was immediate. News stations replayed the clip endlessly. Anchors debated it. Politicians commented on it. Activists called for reform. The Lakeview Police Department was forced to hold a press conference, their chief visibly uncomfortable as he promised a transparent investigation. The world had turned its gaze on their small town, and there was no turning back. That evening, as the noise of the outside world faded into the quiet of their home, Emilia sat by the window, watching the lights of passing cars. The fight ahead would be long, she knew that. But as she glanced toward Mark, who sat across the room drafting yet another statement, she felt something she hadn't felt in days, a quiet certainty that they were stronger together than any system that tried to silence them. The confrontation at Lakeview Park had begun as a moment of humiliation and fear. Now it was becoming something else entirely, a spark that neither of them intended to let die. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. Everything seemed both painfully sharp and strangely unreal. Emilia woke each morning expecting, for a brief moment, that things might have returned to normal, that they could simply go back to being an ordinary family again. But reality settled in quickly, as it always does. The world outside their door had taken notice of what had happened in Lakeview Park, and the quiet life they once knew had vanished overnight. Reporters gathered on their street like crows drawn to a storm, their vans parked in a row, cameras pointed toward the house. Headlines appeared across the television screens and news feeds, each one offering a different version of the same story. Some were sympathetic, others skeptical. To the world, they had become symbols. To themselves, they were just a family trying to endure. Mark had transformed their dining table into an improvised command center. Laptops, folders, and documents covered every inch of its wooden surface. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from attorneys, civil rights advocates, journalists, and a few old bureau colleagues who wanted to express support or caution. He barely slept, the lines around his eyes deepening with each passing day. Emilia would watch him sometimes from the couch, one hand resting over her stomach, feeling the baby move gently beneath her palm. The thought that her child would enter the world in the midst of all this chaos filled her with both fear and determination. At first, she had wanted to stay away from the spotlight. The mere thought of cameras made her uneasy. Every time she saw her own face on a television screen or a news article, the humiliation of that day came rushing back, the officer's glare, the sound of Noah's frightened voice, the helplessness that had rooted her to the chair. But the public attention brought something she hadn't expected. Solidarity. Letters began arriving from across the country, people sharing their own experiences with prejudice, police overreach, or disability discrimination. Some wrote about losing faith in justice and how seeing her stand her ground gave them courage. Emilia would sit by the window, reading these letters one by one, tears slipping down her cheeks. They were strangers, yet they understood. Mark's anger had shifted into focus. He was no longer consumed by fury, but driven by purpose. He had met with their attorney, a calm, seasoned woman named Laura James, who specialized in civil rights litigation. Laura had handled dozens of cases involving misconduct and discrimination, but this one, she said, felt different. "You have evidence," she told them during their first meeting. "Witnesses, videos, clear physical aggression. They can't dismiss this as a misunderstanding. The court of public opinion is already watching." Still, Emilia could see the toll it took on Mark. For every step forward, there were obstacles. The police department's statement had been maddeningly vague, full of bureaucratic language about procedural review and pending investigations. Officer Collins remained on administrative leave, but rumors suggested that several officers had rallied around him, defending his actions as standard procedure. The chief of police appeared on local television, insisting that the department was committed to fairness and transparency, his words hollow and practiced. Emilia watched the interview from the living room, her hands shaking with restrained anger. Meanwhile, Noah had grown quieter. He was only 7, but the weight of what he had seen hung over him like a shadow. He asked fewer questions now, perhaps sensing that the answers would only frighten him more. At night, Emilia would tuck him into bed, and he would whisper, "They won't hurt us again, right?" She would smooth his hair and say the words she needed to believe herself. "No, sweetheart, they won't." The turning point came when Laura called with news that a prominent civil rights organization wanted to support their case publicly. They were planning a rally in Lakeview to demand accountability and reform, and they wanted Amelia and Mark to attend. At first, Amelia hesitated. The idea of standing before a crowd, reliving everything, terrified her. But Mark's voice was steady when he said, "This isn't just about us anymore. If we speak, maybe someone will finally listen." The morning of the rally dawned cool and overcast, a welcome break from the relentless heat of summer. The streets outside City Hall were lined with people holding signs. Justice for Amelia, end police abuse, equality for all. Some had driven hours to be there. Others were local residents who had once felt powerless and now found courage in numbers. The hum of conversation filled the air, mingling with the rhythmic beat of distant drums and the occasional chant from the crowd. Amelia sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the makeshift stage, her hands clasped tightly together, while Mark stood beside her, looking out over the sea of faces. When Laura introduced them, the applause was overwhelming. Amelia's heart pounded as she took the microphone, the sound of her own voice trembling in her ears. "I never imagined I'd be standing here," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I came to Lakeview Park that day as a mother, as a wife, just hoping to give my son a day of happiness. I never thought it would end in fear." She paused, swallowing hard. "But what happened to me wasn't just about one officer or one mistake. It's about a system that teaches people to see others as suspects instead of human beings. It's about being told that your pain doesn't matter, that your word isn't enough." The crowd was silent, listening. Amelia's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I'm not here to spread hate. I'm here because I believe we can do better. I believe that justice means more than punishment. It means change." When she finished, the applause rolled through the square like thunder. Mark stepped forward next, his tone calm but firm as he spoke about accountability, respect, and the duty of those in power to serve without prejudice. His words carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen both the best and worst sides of the system he represented. The rally became more than a protest. It became a moment of unity. Families who had endured similar experiences came forward to share their stories. Local leaders promised to push for reform. Journalists captured every moment, their cameras flashing like lightning against the gray sky. By the time the event ended, Amelia felt drained yet lighter, as if speaking the truth aloud had lifted part of the burden she'd been carrying. In the weeks that followed, the movement grew. Petitions circulated, demanding the dismissal of Officer Collins and mandatory sensitivity training for all local law enforcement. News outlets kept the story alive, and what had begun as a local scandal became a national conversation. Still, not everyone supported them. Online trolls flooded comment sections with venomous remarks, accusing Amelia of exaggerating, of playing the victim. Some questioned Mark's integrity as an FBI agent, claiming he had used his position to intimidate local officers. The cruelty of strangers was relentless, but Amelia refused to look away. She read everything, even the ugliness, reminding herself that silence had never changed anything. Mark, meanwhile, continued to fight. He worked with Laura to prepare their civil suit, gathering statements, reviewing footage, building a timeline that laid bare the truth. He also faced his own battles within the Bureau, where some colleagues urged him to let the matter rest. "It's not worth the career fallout," one warned. Mark's response was simple. "If I can't stand up for my family, what's the point of the badge?" The day the lawsuit was officially filed, Amelia stood beside him on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, reporters shouting questions. She felt the familiar nerves twist in her stomach, but also a new steadiness. They weren't victims anymore. They were standing together, defying the silence that so often followed injustice. That night, when the house was finally quiet and Noah asleep, Amelia sat with Mark in the dim light of the living room. The exhaustion of the past weeks weighed heavily on both of them, but there was something else now, a sense of purpose that refused to fade. "Do you ever wish we just stayed home that day?" she asked softly. Mark was silent for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but if we had, this would still be happening to someone else. Maybe this was supposed to happen to us, so we could do something about it." She thought about that as the clock ticked steadily in the background. Maybe he was right. Maybe life had a way of choosing its fighters. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "Then we fight," she said, "until something changes." He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers in the quiet glow of the lamp. "Together," he said. Outside, the night was still. The world beyond their window remained uncertain, but inside their home, something solid had formed, a shared resolve, unspoken yet undeniable. They had been thrust into this battle unwillingly, but now it was theirs to carry. The humiliation, the fear, the outrage, they had all been transformed into something stronger, and though the road ahead was long and filled with obstacles, they were ready to walk it side by side. Autumn came early that year, painting the trees of Lakeview in shades of gold and amber that looked almost unreal beneath the wide blue sky. The air had grown cooler, cleaner, filled with the smell of rain and the distant hum of life returning to its usual rhythm. Yet for Amelia and Mark, nothing about life felt ordinary anymore. The quiet mornings that used to belong to laughter and breakfast with Noah were now filled with calls from lawyers, interviews, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. The case had moved into its next phase, the courtroom. And though Amelia dreaded stepping back into that spotlight, she knew there was no turning back. What had begun as humiliation in a public park had become a fight for dignity, not just her own, but for countless others who had been silenced. The courthouse in downtown Lakeview was a stately building of red brick and white columns, the kind that made people lower their voices as they entered. The air inside always smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and tension. Every morning, Amelia would arrive with Mark by her side, and Laura, their attorney, walking slightly ahead with a briefcase in hand. The media gathered at the steps each day, their cameras flashing, their questions swirling in the air like gnats. Some shouted her name, asking how she felt, if she believed justice would be served. She rarely answered. Words she had learned could be twisted. The truth, however, could not. Inside the courtroom, everything felt amplified. The creak of wooden benches, the shuffle of papers, the weight of eyes watching her from every direction. Officer Collins sat at the defense table, his uniform replaced by a crisp gray suit. He looked different without the badge, smaller somehow, though the arrogance still lingered in the tilt of his chin. He refused to meet her eyes. His attorney spoke for him, arguing that the officer had acted out of caution, that he had followed procedure, that any perceived aggression was a misunderstanding exacerbated by public hysteria. Each word made Amelia's stomach tighten, but she sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. Mark, seated beside her, was a portrait of control. His jaw was set, his gaze unflinching. He had faced hardened criminals and interrogated men who had committed unspeakable acts, but this was different. This was personal. Each time the defense tried to diminish what Amelia had endured, something inside him tensed like a drawn bow. Laura, on the other hand, remained composed. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of conviction, sharpened by experience. She laid out the timeline, the video evidence, the testimonies of witnesses who had seen the officer yank Amelia's wheelchair, the fear in her child's face, the moment of unjust force. The video played on a large screen at the front of the courtroom. Even though Amelia had seen it before again and again on news broadcasts and social media, it still made her chest tighten. The sound of her own voice pleading for calm, her son's cry, the shove that had sent pain through her abdomen, it all came flooding back. There was a murmur in the room when the footage ended, the weight of what they had seen pressing down on everyone present. Even the judge, a measured woman with a sharp gaze, paused for a moment before continuing. When it was her turn to testify, Amelia took a slow breath and wheeled herself to the witness stand. Her palms were damp against the metal rims, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment countless times with Laura, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of it. The courtroom seemed to shrink as she raised her hand and took the oath. For a second, she thought of Noah, of the way he had clung to her that day, whispering for her not to be taken away. That memory steadied her. She spoke clearly, her voice soft but unwavering. She described the day, the sunlight on the pavement, her son's laughter, the way she had felt safe until that safety was ripped away. She told them how it felt to be doubted, to be treated like a criminal for asking for what she was entitled to have her body and her dignity assaulted under the pretense of authority. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. No interruptions, no whispers, only the sound of her words falling into the still air with the weight of truth. When the defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting that perhaps she had overreacted, that emotions had clouded her perception, Emilia looked at him steadily and said, "Fear doesn't cloud your vision, sir. It sharpens it. I remember everything." The silence that followed was heavier than any objection. Mark testified next. He kept his composure, though Emilia could see the tightness in his jaw, the storm in his eyes. He described the moment he had arrived, the sight of his wife being manhandled, the disbelief that turned into fury. When the defense tried to imply that he had escalated the situation by revealing his FBI badge, he simply replied, "I didn't escalate it, I stopped it, because what I saw wasn't law enforcement, it was abuse." His voice carried through the courtroom like a blade of steel cutting through fog. The trial stretched on for days that felt like months. Reporters filled every seat in the back rows, and outside the protest continued. Crowds holding signs chanting for justice, for reform, for accountability. Some nights Emilia and Mark would come home exhausted, too tired to speak. They would sit in silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in their kitchen. Noah would ask if the bad man was going to jail, and Emilia would hold him close and say, "We'll know soon, sweetheart." When the closing arguments came, Laura spoke with quiet power. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried a clarity that cut through the noise. "This case isn't just about one officer's actions," she said, looking directly at the jury. "It's about a choice between believing that authority excuses cruelty or believing that every person, no matter their circumstance, deserves respect and dignity." Mrs. Carter was not a threat. She was a woman asking for fairness. The question before you isn't whether the officer made a mistake. It's whether you will let that mistake go unpunished. The defense argued predictably that emotions had overrun judgment, that the officer had feared for safety, that the crowd had escalated the event. But their words rang hollow against the evidence. The jurors watched the video again in deliberation. They read the transcripts. They listened to the echoes of fear and reason woven through every testimony. It took 2 days. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Emilia sat gripping Mark's hand so tightly her knuckles ached. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. When the foreman stood and read the words, "Guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority," Emilia felt something break inside her, not in pain, but in release. It was as if the breath she had been holding since that awful day at the park had finally escaped. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters whispering, cameras clicking, a murmur of relief from the supporters seated in the back. Officer Collins sat motionless, his face pale. The judge's gavel came down, calling for order. The sentence would be determined later, but the verdict itself was victory enough. For the first time in months, Emilia felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and bright. The crowd that had gathered broke into cheers as Emilia and Mark emerged, hand in hand. Reporters swarmed, microphones flashing, but this time she didn't hide. She faced the cameras, her voice calm and steady. "Today isn't just about what happened to me," she said. "It's about what happens next. No one should be afraid to ask for help. No one should fear the people sworn to protect them. Change doesn't come easily, but it begins when we refuse to stay silent." The applause that followed wasn't wild or deafening. It was warm, steady, human. Mark stood beside her, pride and emotion flickering in his eyes. Laura smiled quietly from a few steps away, her job done, her belief in justice reaffirmed. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect of the verdict spread. The Lakeview Police Department announced new training programs focused on empathy and bias awareness. A civilian review board was established to oversee complaints of misconduct. Other towns nearby took notice, beginning their own reforms. It wasn't revolution, not yet, but it was progress, a slow, steady march towards something better. At home, life began to find a new rhythm. The reporters eventually left. The phone stopped ringing so often, and quiet returned to their small house. Emilia gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a cold November morning. When the nurse placed the child in her arms, she looked down at the tiny face and whispered, "You're safe now." Mark stood by her side, tears glistening in his eyes, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They named her Hope. Months later, as winter melted into spring, Emilia and Mark returned to Lakeview Park. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and laughter from children running through the grass. The place that had once been the scene of pain now felt different, transformed by time and healing. Emilia pushed her wheelchair slowly along the path, with Hope nestled in her arms and Noah skipping ahead, pointing excitedly at the Ferris wheel in the distance. Mark walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. "Feels strange being here again," he said softly. She nodded. Strange, but right. They reached the bench near the entrance, the same one where she had waited that fateful day. For a long moment they stood in silence, each lost in thought. Then Emilia looked at her husband, a small smile playing at her lips. "We came full circle," she said. Mark looked at her, then out at the park. "Yeah," he said, "but this time it's different." And it was. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because they had. They had faced the worst of it, the fear, the humiliation, the anger, and somehow emerged stronger, bound not just by love, but by purpose. What had once been a wound had become a scar, and like all scars, it was proof of survival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a golden glow, Emilia held Hope close, watching Noah laugh as Mark lifted him onto his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace, not the absence of struggle, but the quiet strength that came from knowing they had endured, and that their story had mattered. In the distance, the Ferris wheel turned slowly against the evening sky, its lights flickering to life one by one. Emilia smiled, feeling the weight of the past ease into something lighter. The world was imperfect, but it was theirs to shape, and as long as there were people willing to stand, to speak, to fight for what was right, there was hope, not just in her arms, but all around them. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are many more powerful stories like this one waiting for you. Share this video with your friends and family so more people can see it and join the conversation. And when you're done, check out our other videos. Each one carries a message of courage, hope, and justice. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.